They demanded a national public inquiry. But Starmer refused. Since then, pressure has been building on the Prime Minister, the UK's opposition parties, Elon Musk, American activists. All of them want Keir Starmer to order an inquiry.
Labour's shameless refusal to investigate grooming gangs has brought them an utter humiliation.
This issue of a delay is a weak excuse. This is one of the worst scandals in British history, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer is now in a severe crisis and scrambling with the hypocritical excuses to justify his failure to act earlier.
Embarrassment for Sir Keir Starmer, a major one, as a cabinet member's constituency has sensationally voted for a national inquiry into the grooming gang scandal.
A huge political and public outrage is now forcing Labour to bring justice to the victims.
The additional significance there is that Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, came out for a limited inquiry after the government voted down that Conservative amendment that would have put forward a national inquiry into the grooming gang scandal when that happened earlier this month in Parliament on the 8th of January. So what we've seen today actually is the second attempt by independent councillor Maureen O'Byrne to bring this motion into Wigan Council's chambers.
Keir Starmer wanted to bury the grooming gangs case, but now his own party isn't playing along.
Today, all the Labour councillors again voted against having that motion being debated. It just went straight to a vote, which was upheld unanimously by all councillors, 64 Labour, 10 Independent, 1 Tory, all of those present within those numbers voting unanimously in favour of it. I'm also told that a couple of Labour councillors abstained from the vote against.
It seems as though the Labour Party came out of the delusional world and are finally taking action after a huge mounting pressure.
But yep, there have now been several votes on this issue in council chambers and some problems for the government here, Martin, as you're seeing Labour-run authorities voting in favour of statutory national investigations, very much against the government's position.
Labour's disgraceful delaying of the grooming gangs inquiry has exposed their true face.
Although, as you said, Labour councillors disgracefully walked out when Maureen was trying to speak. She also tried to issue a statement in this debate there. She wasn't allowed to do that. I've got that statement here. It is, of course, some of the most harrowing evidence, Charlie Peters, as you know, from the Oxford rape gang trial. The extracts actually that woke the entire world up to this, including Elon Musk, with you pushing this forward. We've got Maureen O'Byrne.
The pressure from Elon Musk is now turning tables, and Labour can't escape from facing the bitter reality.
Something is happening. It feels like the tide has turned. It feels like perhaps, hopefully, fingers crossed, everything crossed, now the dam is finally beginning to break.
Well, Martin, there has been a change in tone from several people within the government. We heard from the Prime Minister's spokesperson right after that vote was rejected in Parliament, when the spokesperson said that the Prime Minister was open to the issue. We've also heard in that announcement made a couple of weeks ago when the government was pushing for 5 more local inquiries that they would.
The entire Labour Party is rattled to its core about the investigation because it can expose their sinister plans to save certain communities in the UK.
What was happening here was Labour was building its own position, so they weren't to be seen to be reacting to pressure from Elon Musk and others, but other people close to the situation in Number 10 have told me that that's not the case, that Labour is not seeking to change its position. The government won't stray from its current stance in favour of local inquiries. But what we're seeing now, Martin, is that so many of those local areas are voting for national inquiries. They're voting for statutory inquiries.
A Labour council has officially supported the very investigation Starmer tried to avoid. Is this the beginning of the end for the Labour Party?
Look at that clip of Maureen O'Byrne attempting to speak when the Labour councillors, I think, disgracefully walked out. Let's have a look at that now.
Yeah, pretty significant incident that, Martin. They say, the Wigan Council have said that it reached a guillotine, which means that there was outstanding business remaining on the agenda. That's their term, they say. So 3 hours the council meeting had been taken on, and that came to an end.
The devastated victims are fed up with the disgusting politics and shameful delaying of the inquiry, and now they are also demanding accountability.
10 days of constant coverage of the national grooming gangs scandal. It sparked so many discussions, so many debates, and also plenty of news stories on this issue, an atrocity that has scarred so much of the country. Many of the people getting in touch with GB News have brought us new stories that we've shown on air. But beyond that most important part of this discussion, the survivors, their families, and the campaigners, there's also a lot of politics going on. There is a big debate in Westminster.
For years, the Labour government was criticised for their hypocritical behaviour, ignoring the growing issue of grooming gangs. Even though more and more people were speaking out, the government seemed reluctant to act. Some argued they were afraid of upsetting certain groups or facing backlash. Instead of jumping into an investigation, they avoided making any real decisions. This left many victims feeling forgotten and let down by the very people who were supposed to protect them. It was almost like they didn't want to deal with the mess, hoping it would just go away on its own. People are left wondering if this country is a joke to them.
That Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister, had denied an independent government-led inquiry into the scandal in Oldham. That sparked that Tory opposition, backed up by Reform UK, calling for something beyond just Oldham, but that looks into the 50 different towns and cities across the country where GB News has found evidence of this sort of abuse. Now, what has the government said to that? Well, of course, they turned down that demand for an inquiry. They voted it down on Wednesday. 364 MPs, including also members of the Lib Dems, voting against it. Many Labour MPs and senior public figures have defended that move.
Even when the pressure from the public kept building, the Labour government didn't want to launch a full investigation. Instead, they pushed for a plan of action. They kept saying it would be more effective than an open inquiry, but people began to wonder if this was just a way to avoid facing the ugly truths that a real investigation would bring to light. Victims and their families felt frustrated, as though Labour was putting politics before the urgent need to address the issue head-on. Is this how Brits deserve to be treated?
I don't think she'd ever really be pushed. I think Labour possibly are quite keen for this story to go away. They're quite keen for the coverage of the grooming gangs issue to pass because it has caused such a headache for the Prime Minister. And really, in terms of Labour figures who've sparked this challenge, the first people to call for an inquiry were Blue Labour, that group within the party, typically seen as more conservative-leaning. Maurice Glasman, a Labour peer, he backed a national inquiry. He told GB News exclusively he was doing so the day before.
By the time they finally agreed to an inquiry, it was clear that they had wasted valuable time. The delay made many people question why they hadn't acted sooner. As the investigation went on, it became obvious that their reluctance to take action had allowed these grooming gangs to continue their abuse for far too long. Victims were left wondering how many lives could have been spared if the government had taken action when they were first asked to. The damage had already been done and the public trust was shaken. They no longer feel safe in a criminal-friendly Britain.
Thousands of girls were tortured and sexually abused at the hands of men who treated them as things to be used and disposed of, destroying many lives forever. The Prime Minister has mentioned previous inquiries. He is right. There has been an inquiry into child sexual abuse, but it wasn't about the rape gang scandal. In its 468 pages, it mentioned Rotherham just once. Is the Prime Minister confident that we know the full extent of rape gang activity?
Kemi Badenoch has definitely never been one to hold back, and when it comes to the issue of grooming gangs, she's been slamming Labour for the worst cover-ups. She's repeatedly brought it up in public discussions, claiming that these gangs are a serious problem in the UK, and she's not afraid to point the finger at certain communities. She has linked the issue to race and immigration, suggesting that some immigrant groups, particularly within Muslim communities, are disproportionately involved. Her comments have sparked heated debates, with some people applauding her for addressing an uncomfortable topic, while others argue she's fueling division and leaning into dangerous stereotypes.
This is a really serious issue. We must focus, obviously, on the victims and survivors. There's no fixed view on the victims and survivors about a further national inquiry. There are mixed views. But there is a view, and I share this view, that what is needed now is action on what we already know. We already know, myself from personal knowledge when I was Chief Prosecutor, that warped ideas, myths and stereotypes about victims are at the heart of this. We've known that for a...
The issue of grooming gangs had been simmering beneath the surface for years, but it wasn't until British politicians began speaking out the truth. It wasn't just a sudden revelation, it was a ticking time bomb, one that had been carefully buried in the archives of political agendas. The whispers started slowly, first among local authorities, then spreading to the media, but it was the politicians who could ultimately give it a voice, turning the scandal into a national conversation.
But one victim from Telford says she wants a national inquiry because it will hold people accountable in a way that previous inquiries have not. It is very possible to have actions, take on more, and still have a national inquiry. So why won't he listen to victims and launch a national inquiry which would have the power to summon witnesses and make them give evidence under oath?
The reason this national inquiry has been delayed for so long is simple. Too many powerful people don't want it to happen. A victim expressed that a full-scale national inquiry is the only way to hold every guilty person accountable. Not just the perpetrators, but those who enabled and covered up these crimes. And she's absolutely right. It's not an either-or situation. Action can be taken against criminals while a national inquiry exposes the full extent of the failure. So why the resistance? Why won't they listen to the victims? A proper inquiry would have the power to summon witnesses, force them to testify, and drag the truth into the light. And maybe that's exactly what Labour fears the most.
Today, he will tell Labour MPs, including in Telford, Rochdale, Bristol, Derby, Aylesbury, Oldham, Bradford, Peterborough, Coventry, Middlesbrough, Newcastle, Ramsgate, to tell all of these people to vote against a national inquiry into the gangs which have systematically gang raped children in their constituencies. This is one of the worst scandals in British history, Mr. Speaker.
The issue of grooming gangs was not something that could simply be brushed aside. It was a national crisis that demanded attention, and it wasn't going away. Starmer seemed to be stuck in the background, unwilling or unable to take a firm stance. It wasn't just frustrating and damaging. People started to feel like they were being completely ignored, as if their anger and calls for action didn't matter. This growing sense of neglect brought an outrageous reaction from the British public.
And that's what we're calling for. The J report, Prime Minister, was a shotgun. It was talking about abuse of children at all different levels. What we're asking for is a rifle shot that focuses on these grooming gangs. And yes, there's no getting away from it. There is a big emphasis on particularly elements of the Pakistani community within this. That's what we want. We don't want it to take 7 years. We want it to be over in a year.
With severe backlash from the public, Labour needed to show that they were listening and were willing to confront the issues head-on, even if it meant reopening a controversial wound. Politicians in the party knew that if they positioned themselves as the ones pushing for justice, they could tap into the public's growing anger and frustration. It wasn't just about the grooming gangs anymore. It was about regaining control of the political narrative.
Systematic rape, neglect, disbelief. This needs to be exercised from the body politic. I completely agree. I think we should have a 9-month commission.
Yeah.
I think it should have powers of arrest. I think it's got to look absolutely at Pakistani gang rape, systematic abuse, and the people who have been reluctant to investigate it have got to be themselves investigated. This is not...
The timing was impeccable. Just as the country's frustrations reached a boiling point, the inquiry was launched, giving them a much-needed lifeline. The grooming gang issue is one that can't be ignored any longer. It's important to investigate not just to bring justice to the victims, but to understand how these gangs were able to operate for so long. Without a proper inquiry, we'll never know how deep this problem runs or who is responsible. We owe it to the victims to get to the truth.
Our only concern, you and I, has to be with the redemption of the lives of the victims,
yes,
the exposure of the people who covered it up. That's all. This is too disgusting and too horrible to get involved in party politics on that. If the Prime Minister is moving to that position, but I don't want to call it a limited inquiry, I want to call it a real inquiry, even a royal commission.
A specific yes,
thing
yes,
into the systematic sexual abuse of working class girls.
For years, the topic had been deemed too sensitive, the allegations too explosive. Starmer's reluctance to address the issue head-on left many wondering if he was avoiding it for political reasons. By not showing leadership, he seemed like he was playing it safe, trying not to upset anyone. But in doing so, he alienated the very people who needed to see strong leadership from him. Politicians tiptoed around the issue, fearful of being labelled as racist or xenophobic. But as the pressure mounted, it became impossible to avoid.
And the question that I would like to have asked many of those Labour MPs who were standing up and dismissing the case for this is, are you really confident in your heart of hearts that there isn't anything untoward here in the sense of a cover-up? And I just don't think that anybody in the House of Commons can say with certainty that that isn't the case. I think there are really genuine concerns. In fact, we are seeing new allegations come forward. Andy Burnham is a savvy politician.
The national inquiry into grooming gangs became more than just a search for truth. It turned into a political battleground, with Labour seizing the moment to rebuild its fractured image. While the victims' voices were finally being heard, the political calculations were hard to ignore. For Labour, it was an opportunity to distance themselves from their unfulfilled promises and weak track record, presenting themselves as the party of justice and accountability.
With the redemption of the lives of the victims, the exposure of the people who covered it up, that's all. This is too disgusting and too horrible to get involved in party politics on that. If the Prime Minister is moving to that position, but I don't want to call it a limited inquiry, I want to call it a real inquiry, even a royal commission.
A specific
thing into the systematic sexual abuse.
Is it because protests began popping up across the country? Victims' families and activists rallied in front of government buildings, demanding action. People took to the streets, holding signs and shouting their outrage. The message was clear that they want justice, and they want it now. These protests became a symbol of how deeply the public cared about the issue and how fed up they were with the inaction.
Why the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper was saying this in the House of Commons today as she announced a raft of new measures and investigations into child grooming gangs in the UK.
But in order to go much further, I have asked Baroness Louise Casey to oversee a rapid audit of the current scale and nature of gang-based exploitation across the country and to make recommendations on the further work that is needed.
Every media outlet left the Labour Party in shambles because the revelations about the gangs were covered extensively, with reporters highlighting the stories of victims who had been ignored for far too long. Journalists pushed for answers, demanding the government finally take responsibility. The constant media attention made it harder for the government to keep dodging the issue, forcing them to respond.
Labour MPs I speak to regularly who just last week were adamant that there should be no concession on this issue, not on some of the emotions and the issues around the issue, but on the specific issue of a new inquiry of some sort. They just started to soften that position in the past few days. I think a lot of MPs spent time with constituents over the weekend and discovered that while it is not...
As the government continued to drag its feet, the frustration from the public was growing by the day. People weren't just upset, they were downright angry. It felt like no one was listening to their concerns, and that made things even worse. Families of the victims were understandably outraged, but it didn't stop there. Everyday people who saw what was happening and couldn't believe it was being ignored started voicing their anger too. Social media went wild, with post after post calling for justice. Hashtags were everywhere, and the message was clear. People were fed up. The more the government delayed, the more it seemed like they just didn't care about what was happening.
This is a change of position from the government. I think we should be quite clear about that. This was not what was being suggested privately but also publicly by the Prime Minister when in that first speech he gave, which was meant to be about the NHS, the first Monday back at the start of last week, when he had prepared remarks for the inevitable questions about Elon Musk.
On the surface, it seemed like the probe was a chance to address a national crisis, but underneath it was much more than that. For Labour, it was an opportunity to gain back some much-needed credibility. The party had spent years making promises, many of which had been left unfulfilled, and their track record in government was beginning to show cracks.
Suggestion then that the government was going to end up
doing something different,
coordinating these local inquiries. I mean, they did always say that they would back local inquiries, but this sort of nationally mandated local inquiries with this extra national rapid review laid on top with Louise Casey, it is clear that they've moved on this. And by the way, I know it's not the focus today, we should not lose sight of the fact there is no chance Yvette Cooper would have been standing up in the House of Commons saying this today if Elon Musk hadn't taken an issue in.
Elon Musk, who's also a close ally of Donald Trump, has been increasingly vocal on issues of governance and social reform, leaving many to wonder if his opinions are subtly shaping political discourse. With rising pressure from tech moguls and political figures, Labour's hesitation could have deeper, more strategic motivations that tie into broader agendas, making this investigation more explosive.
Address what is a very real concern for lots of people, notwithstanding the fact that it was generated a bit in this iteration by Elon Musk.
And I should just say, as we're recording this episode at 4:50 on Thursday afternoon, Elon Musk did post on X a little while ago. He reposted the Home Office post announcing this action plan, and he then has put his own comment on it saying, I hope this is a proper investigation.
Labour has wasted much time dodging, denying and dismissing calls for a real investigation into grooming gangs, but the cracks in their cover-up are widening and the public is no longer buying their excuses. The truth needs to come out. No more delays, no more political games. A national inquiry isn't just necessary, it's long overdue. The victims deserve justice, and those who enabled these crimes must be held accountable. So, what do you think? Is Labour's sudden shift genuine or just another PR stunt to save face? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to keep exposing the truth they don't want you to hear.